The researcher knows they're risking their career at the SCP Foundation, putting their very reputation in jeopardy. But they can't deny their obsession. The creatures are fascinating, an anomalous insect species with a highly unique pattern of creating habitats inside human beings. The researcher has sidestepped the official approval process, using falsified requisition paperwork to gain access to their new subject in a solitary testing chamber. Everything is off the books, and for months, the insects have been toiling away, making themselves a new home. As they open the secure cell, they know the security officer they paid off will wipe the records of their keycard being used. The researcher steps inside and examines their new hive like a child with an ant farm. The skeleton is withered, misshapen beyond all recognition. Skin has wasted away to the consistency of tissue paper. The researcher wants to see just how much damage has been done. Peering into the gap where the skull used to be, it's immediately clear, even to the naked eye, that a significant portion of the subject's brain is missing. Tens of thousands of insects swarm within the cavity. They have to eat something after all. The portions of the brain that have been left intact are, the researcher has figured out, responsible for regulating the hive's functions. Every twitch could be the few organs left moving inside, or the insect scurrying around. The researcher wouldn't admit it to anyone, but he adores his hive. Getting to examine one this close is something that no other anomalous expert at the Foundation has ever managed to accomplish. It makes it worth the risk. Examining the hive, the researcher notes down any recognizable changes in its state. The decay and deterioration has been going on for months now, so long that day to day there doesn't appear to be much difference. That being said, the host still has their eyes intact, and those are yet another food source for the creatures nesting inside. The researcher gently lifts the eyelids, careful not to tear the delicate skin, and shines a flashlight into the unblinking pupils, expecting nothing but lifeless glass. But then, the shock hits. The eyes move. They're following the light. With a scream, the researcher drops the flashlight and rushes out of the testing chamber. They feel sick, alarmed, distressed. They thought the insects only nested in the dead. They had no idea that the hive was still alive. Given the anomalous nature of this insect species and its more concerning behavioral characteristics, several Foundation researchers examining their behavior have taken to referring to them as the bone hive. The Foundation's leading experts in the field of anomalous entomology were initially tasked with performing a full study into possible origins of the species, classified as SCP-439 following their discovery. The Foundation's findings have indicated a potential connection between the bone hive and Forficula auricularia, otherwise known as the common earwig. However, the exact nature of the presumed connection between the earwig and SCP-439 was somewhat difficult to ascertain, with some skeptical that they are even connected at all. Some researchers within the entomology department became convinced that SCP-439 was a previously undiscovered subspecies of Forficula auricularia. It possesses some similar physical traits, such as the flattened, elongated body shape and slender antennae often associated with earwigs, as well as the characteristic pincers at the tip of the abdomen. Their shared physical similarities begin to differ with their coloration. While most earwigs possess a reddish-brown tint, SCP-439 has more of a gray semi-translucent color to its external skeleton. It measures 2.5 centimeters in length, which seems to be fairly standard for its non-anomalous counterparts. However, not everyone agrees. Several anomalous entomologists have pointed out that SCP-439's behavior is vastly different from that of the common earwig. In their view, the differences are so extreme that any biological relationship between the two is virtually impossible. Forficula auricularia are nocturnal, typically scavenging dead plant and animal matter, then hiding under stones or inside rotten logs during daylight hours. They are considered a common household pest to humans, usually invading any small, dark crevices within homes that might be damp enough to lay eggs. Earwigs feed on organic matter, meaning when infesting human homes, they can often consume food that is stored in kitchen cupboards and pantries. Their colloquial nomenclature of earwigs, from the Old English ear beetle, is attributed to the appearance of their hind legs, as these resemble human ears when unfolded. But there is a popular misconception that these invertebrates climb into human ears whilst a host is asleep, with some stories even suggesting that they lay eggs within human bodies. While this is patently untrue and not how Forficula auricularia reproduces, the same cannot be said for SCP-439. When encountered in a safe environment, SCP-439 is relatively safe for humans to interact with. Much like an earwig, if the insect feels threatened, it will use its abdominal pincers to give someone a firm, painful pinch. However, it is believed that these forceps are more to ward off any potential predators than specifically evolved to cause humans harm. This does not mean that SCP-439 poses no danger to human beings, though. In fact, the opposite is true. One of the largest, if not the largest, difference between SCP-439 and Forficula auricularia is the methods it deploys for constructing a habitat for itself, and how it then reproduces. This is also the largest factor of the anomalous insect's behavior that presents a significant risk to human beings, because SCP-439 uses them as hosts. This was observed firsthand when SCP Foundation researchers initiated an experiment wherein a member of D-Class personnel, referred to as Test Host 1, was instructed to spend 24 hours in a controlled testing environment. The only other inhabitant in the room was SCP-439, though this information was withheld from Test Host 1. Prior to this experiment taking place, other life forms were left alone in the vicinity of SCP-439. Although the insect appeared to show little interest or awareness towards anything other than humans, all other creatures were uniformly rejected. It was only when a researcher, who will remain nameless to spare them embarrassment, noticed SCP-439 displaying significant interest towards them during an examination. The researcher was noticeably exhausted, struggling to keep awake, and this seemed to attract SCP-439. This was the catalyst for the experiment. Test Host 1 was permitted to freely inhabit the testing space and told that they would need to spend the night sleeping in the same room. After around 6 hours, during which proclamations of boredom were made a staggering 1,194 times, Test Host 1 was encouraged to sleep. Laying themselves down on a bunk that had been provided, they soon drifted into unconsciousness, and it was at this point that SCP-439 appeared to display the same interest in the D-Class test subject. Observing through the intense magnification of surveillance cameras within the testing chamber, anomalous entomology researchers noticed that, while Test Host 1 was awake, the insect had been hiding in a corner of the room, seemingly waiting for an opportune moment. It managed to remain undetected until the test subject fell asleep, though exactly how it was able to determine the D-Class personnel member was, in fact, asleep is unknown. It was at this point, though, that SCP-439 approached the bunk where Test Host 1 was dozing, crawling up the legs and over the blankets, before climbing into the test subject's mouth. Surveillance equipment in the room was immediately switched to display an X-ray look at the interior of Test Host 1's body. Researchers spotted SCP-439 traversing its way down the D-Class member's trachea, before eventually arriving within one of their lungs. Once here, the insect appeared to situate itself within the lung, using it as a habitat. Observation of Test Host 1 continued, with the subject awakening suddenly around 4 hours later, noticeably in some degree of distress. When questioned about this, the D-Class complained of intense chest pains, as well as showing significant shortness of breath. As they became increasingly frantic, they accused the researchers of administering some unknown substance while they had slept. At this point in the experiment, Foundation wellness handlers were dispatched to the control environment to try and calm the test subject and administer a sedative. However, before an attempt could be made to subdue Test Host 1, they doubled over in severe pain, complaining of excruciating abdominal cramping. They were still struggling to breathe, with the tightness in their chest increasing. An alarm was sounded and an emergency medical code issued for on-site medical staff, who were instructed to resuscitate Test Host 1 without causing any harm to the SCP-439 specimen currently nested in their lung. By the time emergency medical staff arrived, they noted that the subject had a rapidly climbing fever and was struggling to move, eventually becoming incapacitated entirely. Pulse checks confirmed that they were still alive, and medics were instructed to back away from the D-Class and allow the observation to continue. Though what occurred next was pretty hard to miss. Estimated to have occurred somewhere between 4 to 8 hours after SCP-439 entered the lung, Test Host 1's incapacitated body began convulsing violently. They began suffering the rapid onset of a condition that closely resembled fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, a normally genetic disorder that promotes the overgrowth of bones, often causing them to grow into muscle tissue. Their body began quickly developing new bones, these protrusions occurring so fast that they quickly began to pierce their way through muscle, flesh, and skin. The process was evidently even more painful, with the D-Class test subject screaming as several bone spurs began to protrude outwards from underneath their flesh. Despite their attempts to treat the resultant injuries, emergency medical personnel were unable to stop the copious bleeding. Their efforts were further hindered by the movement of Test Host 1, as the subject in question appeared to regain some semblance of consciousness, evading the aid of Foundation medics and attempting to hide under the bunk. It was later determined by anomalous entomology experts that something about the process compelled them to seek out shelter, drawn to the nearest darkened, enclosed space that they could find. Some have suggested that if Test Host 1's alteration by SCP-439 had occurred, say within a house, that they might have been drawn towards cabinets, closets, and heating ductwork. Petitions were made by the research teams observing Test Host 1 to continue the experiment without treatment in case of further development in the subject's condition. Despite a staunch opposition from the Foundation's ever-redundant ethics committee, continuation of the experiment was granted, and Test Host 1 was left untreated for 3 whole days. 2 days into the continuation, researchers requested that audio surveillance feeds of the testing chamber be cut, as they grew uncomfortable listening to the D-Class subject's screams of pain. By the 3rd day, the test subject was immobilized, thanks in no small part to the excruciating pain of the new bones growing, coupled with their difficulty breathing. It was at this point that the subject entered what the research team considered the final stage of transformation. Concealed in its new home under the bed, the affected subject slowly huddled into a fetal position, and as observed by X-ray scans, their skeletal structure continued to undergo anomalous changes. Entire portions of Test Host 1's skeleton began shifting inside them. While this was occurring internally, externally, the rest of their body was shriveling, shrinking down to around 3/4 of its original size. This continued until the host body was almost completely spherical in shape, though new bone protrusions continued to grow after the cessation of regular life signs. These newer protrusions seemed to anchor the host body in place, keeping it permanently in its new location. At this point, permission to conduct a close examination of Test Host 1 was approved. Several of the research team entered the testing chamber wearing protective coverings over their faces and hands. The skeletal structure that had once been a living member of D-Class had been rendered unrecognizable, converted into what some of the research team described as a cage. It was difficult to ascertain exactly how much internal damage had been caused by SCP-439, though close scans seemed to indicate that several of Test Host 1's internal organs remained functional, albeit in a limited capacity. This discovery sparked an ongoing internal investigation by the SCP Foundation Ethics Committee regarding the potential harm of allowing experimentation with SCP-439 to be performed on future human hosts. The main point of argument the committee has posed is that, while they may not be conscious, there are those who have debated that hosts could still be considered alive at this point in the process. Whether this constitutes grounds to halt experimentation on human test subjects is a matter that is still yet to be resolved. Monitoring of the newly formed bone hive continued, as spectral analysis revealed movement was occurring within the host long after its external movements had ceased. This wasn't the movement solely of internal organs, but of the colony that was now using the body of Test Host 1 as a home. The specimen of SCP-439 that had initially been allowed to nest inside of the D-Class test subject's lung had since become a queen, producing between 20 to 30,000 offspring. Initially, exactly how this had occurred was unknown. No mating process of SCP-439 was ever observed, leading Foundation researchers to the hasty conclusion that the insects must have reproduced asexually. These offspring of the original queen seemed to match the behavior exhibited by workers, drones, and warriors, distinguished by their large, powerful abdominal forceps. These specimens seem to match the typical roles found in other non-anomalous insect colonies, conforming to an insect hierarchy that was typical of most hive-based creatures. Of all the specimens now active within the remains of Test Host 1, only the queen appeared to be capable of reproducing. For a time, quarantine procedures were considered, as well as total incineration of the bone hive by mobile task force operatives using flamethrowers, in order to prevent a possible infestation. However, once it was confirmed that none of the other specimens posed a significant risk, these safety measures were rescinded. Research teams were flabbergasted by the state of the interior of what had previously been Test Host 1. The structure within was virtually unrecognizable as a human body, with various internal organs having been removed and seemingly destroyed. However, the lack of waste or residual tissue seemed to indicate that these organs had been consumed by the members of the SCP-439 hive and used as a food source. Other organs had been modified by the workers to be repurposed as incubation chambers for the eggs laid by the insect's queen. Most notably, anomalous entomology experts observed what they considered to be an indigenous behavioral trait that appeared to be unique to SCP-439 specimens. These anomalous earwigs appeared to use the digestive system of their host's body to process organic materials that warriors collected and deposited into the host's stomach. The colony will then manipulate the upper and lower intestines of their host, breaking down the organic matter into a slurry of nutrients. This is then used as food for the insects, and additionally allows the host structure to be sustained without succumbing entirely to total collapse. The state that hosts are kept in was described by one Foundation entomologist as a waking death. Colonies of SCP-439 cannot exist in perpetuity, however. In fact, their primary biological function appears to be to continue harvesting organ matter from their host until the colony produces a new queen. This occurred within 6 months of the initial implantation of SCP-439 into Test Host 1, though it's estimated that a new queen can be born in as few as 4 months in other cases. Once this new queen has emerged from within the colony's ranks, it will select a drone to mate with. This process completely derailed the Foundation entomologists' prior train of thought. They had previously believed SCP-439 to be capable of asexual reproduction. It appeared that the prior specimen had been impregnated with the necessary offspring to start a new colony at some point prior to being discovered by the Foundation. Once the new replacement queen is inseminated, the work of the existing colony ends. The specimens of SCP-439 will destroy themselves by rupturing the redacted within the host's body, ensuring the majority of the insects are killed while the new queen is protected. Workers and drones are unable to survive outside of the host, while warriors will abandon the hive to die having completed their tasks. These insects cannot consume any organic matter apart from the NutraHive slurry produced by the colony, so they will inevitably die once departing their hive of origin. The sole survivor, the newly formed replacement queen, will then exit the bone hive, fertilized and ready to locate a new human being to serve as the host for the next colony. It appears that these SCP-439 queens are able to stay fertilized in near perpetuity until they have entered a new host, though they cannot implant themselves within any mammals other than humans. The now vacant host of the previous colony will cease any residual life signs following the evacuation. A thorough post-mortem examination of the husk that used to be Test Host 1 revealed that the former test subject had not been killed by the mass trauma of several thousand insects burrowing out of them, but through starvation. Foundation experts in anomalous and altered human biology have posited the theory that the slurry produced by an SCP-439 provides just enough nutrients to keep their hosts on the verge of functionality. But after the evacuation, their bodies are no longer being sustained by this limited supply of cannibalized organic matter. Debate as to whether host bodies can be considered alive or not is still ongoing and unresolved. It is this process of utilizing human bodies as hosts for their hives that constitutes the key difference between SCP-439 and the common earwig. The severity of this difference has led to the belief that the two species only share a slight cosmetic resemblance, which some have chalked up to an evolutionary coincidence. Put simply, SCP-439's behavior is so unusual that it doesn't seem possible to many Foundation researchers that it could possibly be a distant relative of the common earwig. SCP-439 is to be kept at Armed Research Site 45 within the Hazardous Lifeforms Wing in a securely locked containment unit with a connected oxygen supply. Handling of the specimen is only permitted to personnel with Level 2 clearance or higher, and it is to be fed regularly through a feeding tube, using only the approved nutritive substances. While the specimen currently being studied by the Foundation was recovered within mainland China, there have been no reported sightings of similar insects within the vicinity of the redacted province, nor anywhere else in the world. Currently, the only known specimen is the one found by the SCP Foundation. This has not ruled out the possibility of other colonies of SCP-439 existing elsewhere.